to what extent is the challenge of democracy or the reality of authoritarianism in the region, and to what extent does that have to do at all with ultimately the issue of Islam and democracy? I mean, I think I put that out as kind of a controversial question at a conference like this put on by CSID, but I think it's worth thinking about as we go on. So I'm going to ask all our panelists, and we're going to start with John Voll, Professor Voll, to keep their comments to roughly, I hate to say it, but I think I would suggest 6 or 7 minutes, if remotely possible, so we can have something of a discussion and close more or less on time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm assuming that those who needed coffee are already back in or out there. I will try and be maybe even under 7 minutes. I just want to take, for starting the panel, I want to take a look at the actual title of the whole day: Democratization, Authoritarianism, and Radicalization, Exploring the Connections. And to look at the connections between the phenomena that are represented by those terms in possibly a slightly different way from what we have been discussing almost all the time during the day. Starting with the last of the terms, radicalization. Radicalization, in the context of many of the presentations today, has been a negative thing. It causes trouble. It moves to either the radicals become the extremists, and then we're in trouble, and so on. I would like to suggest then that we need to start perhaps by thinking about the relationship, the connection between radicalization and democratization. The mythology, the narrative of democratization that tends to be very popular in this town is that democratization goes with stability and with stabilization. And in then the syllogism, democracy requires stabilization, and then you can have a good democracy. In that syllogism, then you say, we avoid radicalism. The problem with that is that in most societies, democratization represents a relatively radical alternative change. And so that as we're looking at a country like Egypt at the present time, if we want to have democratization, we have to have a radicalization of the politics. The connection between democratization and radicalization is a positive one. Similarly, we, I think, have a connection myth, the first connection myth that, democracy requires stabilization, and I'm suggesting we need to think that democracy is a radical alternative and therefore we need radicalization. I will do the reverse, that I think most of the narratives that we've heard today assume that authoritarianism is an opponent of democratization. Now, I will agree with that. But I think what we need to do is to look behind the democratization and authoritarianism narrative to see that buried in that narrative is an old generalization of modernization, generalization about modernization that was carefully articulated by the Princeton sociologist Manfred Halperin, who was defining modernization in the 1960s, especially in the book, The Politics of Social Change in the Middle East and North Africa. There was in modernization the assumption that democracy didn't just happen. You had to have a kind of transition. And the most effective transition would be an authoritarian rule. So Halperin talks about the authoritarian road to democracy. And the chief primary example in this story was Kemal Ataturk. You had to have Ataturk as a dictator before you could have Turkey as a democracy kind of thing. And I think that as we listen even today This morning, Nather quoted Secretary of State Kerry after the September coup in Egypt in 2013 as talking about the transition, that the coup was a transition. And I would suggest that buried in a lot of the discussion of democratization in policymakers' terms today assumes that authoritarianism is the source of stability, and stability is the context within which democratization can take place, and therefore you hear buried in these comments the transition. The transition to democracy requires some kind of law and order. It requires some kind of authoritarianism. And I would just simply say in sort of closing, if we take Manfred Halpern's sort of thing, the authoritarian road to democracy, I think what we have had in the past 60 years of trying out that sort of thing is that we have discovered that the authoritarian road leads to authoritarianism and it does not lead to democracy. But we've got the connections, interesting connections between democratization, authoritarianism, and radicalization. That authoritarianism leads to authoritarianism and not democracy, and radicalization may be destabilizing, but it may be the only real path to democratization. Thank you.
Wow. Well, how about that for clarity and brevity? That is great. Nathan.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. I'm also going to shoot for clarity and brevity. I mean, one of the benefits of being restricted to 6 minutes, yes, is that you can be impossibly general and just blame the organizers for your inability to go into depth. The truth is, if I give me half an hour, I'd probably still be fairly superficial.
Go ahead, your question.
Okay, yeah. And we're given a fairly broad mandate. I mean, look at the titles in there: Islam, democracy, future, Arab Spring. I'm going to add one more to make it fantastic even broader, and that's politics. And in a sense, there's a reason why that may be missing, because it seems to me the bad news that I have to report, I think from my reading of what is going on in the Arab world right now, in the aftermath of the upheavals of 2011, is essentially politics is broken and politics no longer held the promise that it did 5 years ago. And societies are going to pay deeply, I think, for that. In one sense, democracy is very, very much alive, right? Democracy, I think, is alive in many ways in the religious realm. And I'm not the first person, I'm probably the last person to notice that what is going on in terms of the way in which entire communities are engaged in religious argumentation from very, very different points of view, in which religious authority is far more diffuse and far more easily contested. In one way, when you're talking about religion in the region, there's been a tremendous democratization. There's in a sense been a democratization or even a politicization in the sense of the way people talk to each other. First, remember when I first went to Egypt, which was in 1985, politics was the one thing you didn't discuss. And you didn't discuss it for two reasons. It was dangerous, but it was also incredibly boring. There was nothing to talk about. And that is certainly different today. So in that sense, you've got a very, very active region. What you also had was and this I think was true in the decade prior to the uprisings of 2011, a steady politicization of the societies in the sense that various groups, various orientations increasingly tried to cast their understandings of how to move society in the direction they wanted in political terms. This is a region of the world where there are some differences, and there's some deep differences on all kinds of issues, among them religion. And what was remarkable to me was the way in which people and organizations and groups began to look to the political realm. Not all of them, but begin to invest much more attention and activity and energies and sort of agenda setting in politics. And that fully exploded in 2011. If there's one kind of message that 2011 was based on, that it managed to mobilize large numbers of people over, it was the idea that we've got to get the politics right. If you can reform the political systems, then all other things, all other good things will follow. And so you had a striking difference, as I say, from the region that I first visited in 1983, where politics was boring and politics was dangerous, to politics is exciting and politics has impressive promise. And what 2011 did was pull all kinds of groups in that had been sitting on the sidelines into very, very active politics. And again, I'm speaking with a very, very broad brush here right now. Regimes within the region have been beating that back, and in most countries doing it fairly effectively. So you can still have political discussions, you can still have political ideas, but the minute you try to organize or be active in the political realm, the political sphere is being shut down in country after country in all kinds of brutal ways. And as a result, the kinds of differences that do exist in these societies are no longer translated into political programs. They're no longer translated into, platforms, or we need to authorize, build this kind of institution, or we need to elect this kind of body, and so on. They're increasingly fought out, and they are fought out in very different kinds of ways. And there are ways that are securitized, that are militarized. You see, upsurge of sectarianism and so on. What the sectarian conflicts in the region are essentially about saying we cannot resolve our differences in the political realm. We have to resolve them in different realms, and the results, I think, are frightening. Why I think this is I'll sort of end on a slightly subtle note, or an excuse for a subtle note. That what I've been talking about so far, I think, is very obvious. The long-term cost, I think, will be not simply that political space is being shut down and the kinds of organizations and institutional frameworks that existed in order to help people and facilitate people render their differences into forms that could be negotiated and talked about, discussed, and managed in the political realm. The long-term cost is not simply the loss of those institutions, but the destruction of the faith in politics. I remember talking to an Egyptian Islamist this past summer. He said, anybody who talks about elections in this environment just sounds stupid. And I think that is a lot broader. What has happened is a discrediting of politics. The idea that if you just build an independent judiciary or have an independent election commission, or that if you just have a more empowered parliament, or that if you just write a better constitution, that you will somehow be able to manage these societies in a way and have political authority that's more accountable to the societies, is one that doesn't hold a lot of credibility or an awful lot of promise right now. And so we're not going to see an end to problems within the societies, but I think the big loss of 2011 was a loss of an opportunity to build systems in which the differences within these societies could be rendered into political form and managed through a political process.
Thanks, man. I don't know if we're going to continue this path of optimism moving forward, but in any case, Carl.
Okay.
Well, you can take a shot.
Thank you, Dan. Let me begin with authoritarianism, because, what's happening in the Middle East with the Arab winter and so forth is really, I just want to know, part of a global trend of what we call authoritarian resurgence, though in some ways, I think, it's been worse in the Middle East. According to Freedom House, I think 12 of the 18 countries rate worse today than they did in 2011, and that doesn't include Egypt and Libya. I disagree with Freedom House on the Egypt score, but Egypt today, we know the terrible statistics of last year, almost 500 disappearances, 500 deaths of prisoners in custody, 700 cases of torture and so forth. And last May, 122 people sentenced to death, including our good friend Ahmad Shaheen. And no one I know who follows Egypt closely, and that of course includes Nathan, believes that this repression will lead to a more stable situation. Quite the contrary, and some of you saw the article a few days ago by Gamil Eid in the New York Times, and there's a case, it's about a case being pursued against him and Hossam Baghet, and they're trying to close down these organizations. They reviewed the case yesterday and they added 4 other people to the indictment. And, you know, he believes that the intention of the government is to bring about, to shut down all non-state institutions that are independent of the security agencies and criticize violations of rights. And closing independent civil society, I believe, will not make Egypt any more stable, quite the contrary. And he notes in this article that it will eliminate groups that serve as mediators when there is tension and conflict, leading to situations where ordinary citizens, ordinary conflicts and tensions escalate into nationwide and violent conflict, pretty much what Nathan was just saying. It transforms the entire public sphere into a zero-sum game between the all-powerful state and those whose rights are being threatened. And that's a recipe for social explosion. I think the Nobel Committee was correct in giving the Nobel Prize to civil society in Tunisia, which played the role of mediating between forces that were deeply opposed to each other, secular and Islamist forces that were deeply opposed to each other. And civil society groups there play an indispensable role in connecting the state to society and in achieving nonviolent solutions to conflicts. You take that away and violent conflict becomes, in my view, inevitable. But, you know, the protests in Tunisia and the western part of the country, in Kasserine and other parts in January, 5 years after the Jasmine Revolution, I think undermine the sobering reality that it's not enough just to remove a dictator or even to replace that dictator with a democratically elected. The government has to govern effectively. And in Tunisia, that means providing employment, fighting corruption, reforming the courts and the bureaucracies. And, you know, there just has to be a greater, and this is a point made by Bill Burns and Marwan Mouasher in the Post recently, there has to be a greater collaboration between people inside Tunisia and the international community, where the people inside really have a dramatic commitment to reform, and the international community is going to help that process. And urgent action is needed, and it's needed to be taken now in Tunisia, because if Tunisia is not successful, I think the consequences are going to be devastating. This is the first democracy in the Middle East, and if it fails, and you know we're not home safe yet, the consequences would be very, very dangerous. And there's a dangerous tendency in the U.S. today, I think, to give up on the Middle East and to turn our backs on the region. This tendency, I regret to say, is exceedingly evident throughout the famous article by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, setting forth the president's views on Syria and the region generally. Libya, according to Goldberg, proved to the president, and this is a quote, that the Middle East was best avoided. And at the end, the first conclusion outlined in the summary is that the Middle East is no longer terribly important to American interests. I think that's terribly short-sighted. We took that view in Afghanistan after the withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1988, and the result was civil war, the Taliban, and 9/11. We've stood aside in Syria, and the result has been hundreds of thousands of deaths and a massive refugee crisis that has engulfed not just the neighboring countries in the region, but Europe as well. The problem with the discussion of policy options in this article is that they always seem to be a choice between all or nothing, going to war or standing aside, when the real choices almost always are in between and require weighing the risks of inaction as well as those of reckless action. We have to find an effective way to work with other countries based upon, and use all the assets at our disposal based upon a coherent strategy that takes into account not just immediate threats, but also long-term interests and opportunities. And it's also dangerous, I think, to give up on the possibility that the Middle East can become more democratic, which I think a number of people have done in the Congress as well, and to send the message that it's not in our interest to try to help that process along. We published a number of articles in our Journal of Democracy on the 5th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and you know the conclusions were mixed. A disappointment with the role that secular parties played, role of the media, which was a source really of polarization. One of the most encouraging conclusions in the articles that we ran was the Arab barometer, which concluded that the support for democracy in the region, despite all the economic dislocations and the security threats, the support for democracy in the region has actually remained steady at 70%. So evidently, the Arab people have not given up on democracy, even if many people in the West have come to the conclusion that democracy in the Middle East is not realistic and that trying to encourage it, even very gradually, might be destabilizing and counterproductive and not in the U.S. interest, which I think is, terribly flawed. Certainly the transition process in Egypt was flawed from the start, and there's a lot of blame to go around from the military and the deep state that never had any intention of allowing a real transition to the overreaching and illiberal Islamists, the fractious secular parties, and civil society that was unable to make the transition from protest to politics. And Nathan Brown has written more eloquently about all of this than anyone else, especially the failure of all the participants to appreciate the need to build consensus whenever and wherever possible. Still, that doesn't mean that lessons can't be learned, and that Egyptians who hope for a better future and their allies in the region and in the West should not be thinking very hard now about what went wrong and how, if another opportunity opens up, they can start from a higher level of political maturity, and think of how to build alliances and achieve a better result. I want just a final thought on the problem of Islamist extremism and terrorism. We're at a very dangerous moment now when ISIS and the other extremists have succeeded in creating an ominously polarized political climate, a kind of Huntingtonian clash of civilizations. What we know that there are people in Europe and in this country, and I won't mention any names, who address the problem in those terms, appeal to fear, and project a very confrontational message. I think it's fairly obvious that the only way the jihadists can ultimately be defeated is that if they lose the battle of ideas, the battle of hearts and minds among Muslims, not against us, but within the Muslim world and the Muslim faith. It's a political, intellectual, and religious struggle, a battle of ideas as much and even more than it is a military battle, though of course that battle has to be fought on many levels. I was struck that a UNDP report that just came out on responding to so-called violent extremism in Africa emphasized the ideological dimension of this problem. The Cold War also had a fundamental ideological dimension, and Dan's father was one of the people who fought that battle. And it created institutions like the Congress of Cultural Freedom and Problems of Communism, which Dan's father edited. But the Cold War was fought over an idea, the idea of Marxism, that originated in the West, appealed to a large number of Western intellectuals, and offered an alternative to the idea of democracy that was rooted at the time mostly in Western culture and institutions. It's since spread very dramatically. But the current battle is different. It's not a struggle within the West or between the West and another region, culture, or as Huntington would say, civilization. It's a battle over the identity and the future of the vastly diverse Muslim world writ large, which also includes Muslim minorities in Europe and North America and in scores of other countries that are not part of the traditional Muslim majority countries and regions. It must be fought within that world, led by Muslim religious leaders and educators, intellectuals and activists, workers and entrepreneurs, young people, and especially by women who do not reject the modern world but have a vision of success and achievement within it. Those people are not our enemies, whatever some politicians may say. They are, in fact, the most important friends and allies that we have, and we must know them and do what we can to help them based upon our shared values of human dignity, social justice, and democratic rights and processes. It's their struggle because it's their future, though the outcome of this struggle will significantly affect our common civilization for many generations to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. The last speaker before the conversation, before the final sum up. And I will be equally short. My colleagues have been a great model. First of all, Carl just mentioned the role of women, among other things, in this battle. And you will notice there are no women up here. And so this table right here is probably noticed that she would. But we agreed to be on this thing anyway. We shouldn't have, but there we are. The title we talked about the title of the overall day. The title of this session, The Future of Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring. And Carl has already given us the answer. And the answer to that question is Tunisia. It seems to me that if Tunisia succeeds, then there is a future. Then there is an answer to this question about Islam and democracy. And there is hope that this is something that can happen in the Arab world. So this, I think, is really important. And as Carl also said, my old boss, Bill Burns, and a couple of his colleagues, including Alex Gerasi, who was my colleague at the State Department as well, we were both working for Bill, put out a report out of Carnegie, as well as the op-ed piece that Carl mentioned in the Washington Post, which makes the point that Tunisia can succeed, and it must succeed. And there are things that we can do, and there are things that Tunisians can do. And those two things, those two groups of things, those two sets of things, need to be related in a compact. If the Tunisians do some things on their part, then the international community and the United States ought to play a major role. I fully agree. We ought to be able to provide support for those kinds of things. And the Carnegie report, which I commend to you, talks about some specific things that ought to be done. In particular, intensify engagement and assistance to Tunisia to help support the priorities, including trade concessions, they say. I would say a free trade agreement. I think I said this last year at this discussion. The free trade agreement still hadn't happened, but we'll keep saying it until it does between Tunisia and the United States. I think we'll go a long way, even if it's not signed tomorrow or even next year, but is announced tomorrow and then negotiated over a couple of years, which these things take. But that would send a strong signal for the economy and people thinking about investing in Tunisia, which is going to be an important thing. But the Tunisians have important things to do as well, and it's laid out in the report. They should lead a G7 coordination mechanism, the Tunisians. The Tunisians need to advance reforms that can gain public buy-in. So there are a range of things in this compact that we should sign up for and the Tunisians should sign up for as well. The importance of this for Tunisians is clear. The importance for the region is clear. The Libyans are looking for models. The Egyptians, even though they won't say it out loud, are looking over at Tunisia to see what's going right over there. Maybe not the government, but certainly intellectuals in Cairo have noticed and have said to probably many of people in this room what a model Tunisia provides for the Egyptians. And they want to know kind of what did they do. Well, one of the things they did was have a professional military. The Tunisians did professional military. The Egyptians didn't. But there are other things to learn about the civil society that Carl just talked about as well. Our support in this compact needs to be demand-driven. That is, Tunisians are in the best position to decide, to determine, to request the kind of assistance that we can provide, and we should encourage them to do that. We're not going to be the drivers. We're not going to supply things, and Tunisians need to ask for and then commit to do the kinds of reform. So this is important for the Tunisians, important for the region, important for the United States, and it's important for the future of Islam and democracy. Yeah, over to you.
Right, thank you. Pursued discussions with the authors of this report and followed intimately. I think it's a great report and good recommendations. A few things I'll just set out as my role as chair that I think are interesting that we can or cannot pursue in discussion. I completely agree, and this has been said, I think, by John and by Nathan in particular, that the authoritarian systems in the region were based in large measure on promoting political apathy. And they function like that, and they count on it. Depoliticization and apathy are correlated very closely. And what happened with the Arab political revolt of 2011 is that they broke that mold. And that, regardless of the actual outcome, that was an important, critical moment. You cannot go to the region now and talk about a youth both men and women, who are apathetic. This is a highly charged political environment. The question is what's going to become of it, as Nate was pointed out. And there is an effort to deepen the position of crushing politics at the very point where you have high levels of polarization, and the combination of that is really lethal. On the question of sort of the legacy of authoritarianism, I agree with John Bull in large measure, but if we go back and look at bourgeoism and other forms of sort of authoritarian-driven modernization, some of those patterns did, one can argue, lay some of the preconditions for changes that later on perhaps fed democracy. One can make that argument, for example, in terms of the role and the size of the middle class. But, you know, one can also romanticize those periods. And certainly if we contrast them between what those periods of authoritarian sort of modernization and what we have now, what really strikes one about the present period is the level of violence and the level of irrationality. The level of irrationalism. And this is epitomized in Egypt by the government there. And that's really striking, apart from the fact that this is the government is engaging in a level of repression that is really unprecedented for Egypt itself. But there's also sort of, on the ideological level, an aspect of rationalism that is one could talk about at length, that is upholding this and sustaining this. Third point that I thought about was the role of global authoritarian governments. Carl mentioned the whole debate in the United States prompted by the article on Obama, the Obama doctrine, about decreasing readiness to intervene in the region. We are caught in a situation now where both the U.S. and in Europe, for reasons that are largely economic, I think, there's a real tendency to want to withdraw from international engagement. At the very time where we have Iran, Russia, China, and other global autocracies firmly engaged. And so, you know, they're not constrained by public opinion in the same way that we are. Which is, you know, I mean, I'm not dismissing public opinion. Obama is a domestic president, first and foremost, I believe. But for reasons that have been hotly debated in this town and beyond, he was not willing to engage, particularly in Syria, in the way that his critics believe he should have. And one can debate that, but clearly, putting aside the issue of Obama and the debate about Obama, we are not in a good structural position to see Europe and the United States step up, I'm afraid, and do the kinds of things that this report advocates. And that's a convergence of moments and motivations that is distressing, to say the least. So with those happy notes, I'm going to open up the floor to discussion. We have a good 20 minutes, which is a tribute to the, again, the brevity and clarity of all the members, and the fact that they were so brief and clear, and none of them were women, is extraordinary as well. Yes?
You got the mic.
Sorry, I can't see. Yes, please. This is like an interrogation. The name, rank, and serial.
Ali.
I can talk.
Yes, please.
Ali Abu Zakuk from Libya.